Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library. This presentation and discussion is a part of our new Black Lives Matter series. We have three wonderful guests tonight for presentation and discussion of the idea of reparations and the Black wealth gap in America, how we can fully understand it and how we can close it. We have two scholars who've written a work called From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. The book has been hailed as a work of unrivaled scholarship and the most comprehensive argument for a reparations program in the US to date. This is a deeply perspective-shifting work, and I believe it's a great foundation for public conversation. Our authors are folklorist and museum consultant Kirsten Mullen and Dr. William Darity of Duke's Sanford School of Economics. And we have our own Charlotte City Councilman at large, Braxton Winston. Mr. Winston entered politics, as many leaders do, out of a deep frustration with racial injustice and a desire to create real change. Mr. Winston has been the subject of a Vice documentary called Black South Rising that looks at the new diversity in local government in the South and in Charlotte in particular. Mr. Winston's going to talk briefly about Charlotte and some of the issues that we're working hard to change, and then he will introduce our scholars to give their presentation, which looks at the nation and our history with a larger lens. Please bring your questions for our conversation at the end of the presentation, and we'll have a discussion then. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for that fine introduction. And just as Rachel said, I hope that we can have a conversation, not just between myself, Ms. Mullen, and Dr. Darity, but also with the community at large. First of all, I'm grateful for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library and all the work they do. I've had one of the privileges of being thrust into public office and to public service is that I get the pleasure of joining so many incredible organizations in different conversations and actions, and the work that the library is doing in all 310 square miles of the city of Charlotte and in the greater Mecklenburg County area. I don't think can be understated. I think especially as we've dealt with the effects of the pandemic, the need for a strong library system is readily apparent. You know, if you did get a chance to see that Vice documentary, or if you've worked with me in any capacity over the past 4.5 years here in Charlotte, you know that I am focused on not just political change, not just policy change, but the idea of systemic change. And I truly do believe that while we have to think systemically in order to have those effects, we have to understand the power of our own purview and being able to affect change in our particular part of the system. And that's what I've tried to do in my time on city council. You know, I really started to look deeply at what does that mean? What does systemic change mean? Right? I came into this with on the back of a tragedy, the death of Keith Lamont Scott by the gun of Charlotte-Mecklenburg police. And while police community relations were right at the kind of the fulcrum of the conflict that we were finding in our community, I started asking many different questions of why did that happen there at College Downs? Why did they change their objective from one thing and go to another? And then you start to dig down into the numbers, and you start to dig down into the history of our communities and our neighborhoods, and you will see that the College Downs apartment complex or that neighborhood was rated one of the most inequitable neighborhoods in all of North Carolina. You know, and then as I started kind of digging deeper into what does that mean? How does land use affect the situation? How does the development of roads affect the situation? Why is it that so many of our Black and brown communities don't live close to other resources like schools, jobs, and healthcare? you start to think about, hey, this is not necessarily by accident, that this is intentional. And about about half a year, 6 months after the death of Keith Lamont Scott, I was in the city council chambers, and not at the dais, but in the audience when there was a report presented by the Leading on Opportunity Task Force. And it was based on the work of Raj Chetty, that stated that Charlotte was ranked 50 out of 50th in terms of upward economic mobility. It's an upward economic mobility, meaning the ability to rise up through the ranks by work, by going to school, by living in community. Largely, there were structural impediments that were put there intentionally over time to create this type of an environment in Charlotte. And so I dove down into how do we correct this? How do we correct this? If this was intentionally made, if this was intentionally created over time, then there must be a way that we can intentionally break this down and intentionally get past fixing the ills that we have created. I was privileged and given the responsibility of representing about a million people by being elected to city council later that year. My first term was admittedly pretty much dedicated to learning the ropes, learning how to create policy, learning how to use the systems of a council manager form of government, how to use my place to advocate to different branches of government. And when I was reelected for my second term in 2019, I really did focus on how do we put a restorative lens on the work that we do? How do we acknowledge the past of the role that my board and therefore my role being a city council member in terms of the legacy of this intentional inequity. For instance, Charlotte City Council, our legacy is that of urban renewal, of which many in our community call Negro removal of the Second Ward Brooklyn neighborhood for the advancement of the economic advancement of the city at large, on the backs of removing the economic and generational wealth of existing Charlotteans. This is another book right here, From Here to Equality, that is helping me find my language, right? Helping me to understand from a policymaker's perspective, as well as a Black man, as well as just a citizen of the United States. How do I put all of these things that I'm feeling, that I'm seeing, that are being done to me, but also that I am governing? How do I put this into the context of the type of city, of the type of state, the type of community that we all want and deserve? And it becomes pretty clear that in order to put that reparative, to put that restorative lens on it, my work needs to exist on the spectrum of the systemic repatriation of wealth, of resources, and of policies that will give back to those that it was stolen from. I look forward to having a further conversation with Dr. Darity and Ms. Mullen about this. And like I said, I know that many of you came here to hear their work and hear that conversation. The objective of this book, as they say on page 250, is to make the case for Black reparations. It is to show, and as they reference the Chetty study on page 34, that achievement of some individuals, of some entities, is not the same thing as wealth. And these are things that I think we as communities as a whole need to understand, especially policymakers and lawmakers need to understand. I will say some things about this book, and then I will turn it over. This is something that you can read cover to cover. but this is also something that you can reference, page to page. It is pragmatic. It is emotional in the sense that when you're dealing with these subjects, I don't know how you cannot be emotional when you read the true history of who we are and where we've come from. And I think it's only radical in the fact that some would have you think that the equal protections of rights for all people is a radical thing in this country. I don't think that it is, but it gives that historical lens, but it also makes the business case. It also makes the person to person, the heartfelt case of why this matters. But I don't care who you are. If you're a Republican, if you're a Democrat, if you're from the South, if you're from the North, there is information in this book. There are tools in this book that you can use to find your language and find a better understanding of the things that we are all experiencing and that we all see, but don't necessarily know how to deal with. So I'm encouraged to be part of this conversation, and I look forward to hearing how talking to Ms. Mullen and Dr. Darity about how our work here in Charlotte could greater align with the national push for Black reparations. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Ms. Mullen and Dr. Darity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Braxton Winston, for that generous and just very, very kind and thoughtful introduction. We really, really do appreciate it. I want to say, first of all, that we're really grateful to Rachel Kuby and to the Charlotte Mecklenburg Library for this invitation to be with you this evening. It is a delight and a pleasure. Libraries are among our favorite spaces in the world. This is a place where democracy happens every day, and it's a tremendous asset that all of us in this country should appreciate and support. I want to say my first job on the clock was as a page in the Fort Worth, Texas Public Library, the downtown branch. Yay. Anyway, so long live libraries. Right. So I would have begun the formal part of our presentation by asking, what is reparations and what is not? So what is not reparations? Social programs like the housing voucher program Evanston, Illinois recently passed. Asheville, North Carolina's initiative aimed at increasing, quote, minority participation in the business of the city. Affirmative action, an example of a federal program that is not reparations. Reversing harmful policies without also providing adequate compensation for their effects, not reparations. It's stunning to hear how often the term reparations is being bandied about these days. Prior to the presidential candidate Marianne Williamson's invocation of the term during her campaign in January 2019, few politicians dared speak the word. The problem today, though, is that the term is being applied to a host of acts of individual and community atonement. Are these initiatives the on-ramp for true reparations? We don't think so. Full restitution for Black American descendants of slavery in the United States will require serious, sustained effort, and we are waiting to see who will be the champion of that cause. In March, the Evanston, Illinois City Council passed what it terms a local reparations restorative housing program, basically a housing voucher program meant to compensate for the city's discriminatory policies and practices that were exercised between 1919 and 1969. The program, inaccurately billed as historic, would qualify eligible Black residents to receive up to $25,000 grants for repairs or down payments on homes in Evanston. By constraining the use of the funds for home ownership, the Evanston plan ignores deficits in other forms of assets that few Black Americans possess, such as non-residential real estate, business equity, retirement accounts, savings, and stocks and bonds. Indeed, restricting spending to housing disempowers those recipients by denying them choice over how best to use the funds. That program will earn the city some goodwill, at least for the 16 families that can access the $400,000 that has been earmarked for the program to date. Council members have stipulated that an eventual fund of $10 million will be available, and those funds will be administered for a maximum of 10 years. But that $10 million will come from the cannabis tax revenue. So this is the marijuana tax, which will vary from year to year. Further, the Evanston plan neglects the huge gap in equity in Black and white owned homes, a legacy of segregation and redlining. Nationally, the median appraised value of a home in a white neighborhood is $155,000 greater than the median price of a neighborhood with a majority of Black residents. Now in Evanston, the median price of a new house is about $420,000. Typically a bank would require a significant, up to 20% down payment. That $25,000 housing voucher is not going to go very far, for individuals who are seeking to buy a new home. And on top of that, they would need to meet the, much higher monthly mortgage payments in order to keep the house, right? So that's why Evanston's history of housing discrimination unequivocally reinforces the need for a national program of restitution. Redlining was applied nationwide, and it calls for a national remedy. Moreover, many Black victims of Evanston's practices are not currently residents of the city. How will they get restitution without a national program? This is a housing voucher program, and a very limited one at that. It's not reparations, and calling it so is confusing at best and harmful at worst. The cause of justice for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery is a serious one, and we object to these kinds of piecemeal, bit by bit, and misleading labels. True reparations only can come from a full-scale program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. So we're trying to talk a bit about why the racial wealth gap closure must be reparations. When we were conducting research for our recent publication, From Here to Equality, Sandy and I studied redress programs from around the world. After consulting several successful initiatives, national and international models of restitution, and we can go into some of those in the Q&A if we have time, we crafted our own definition of reparations. For us, reparations are a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. ARC, A-R-C, acknowledgement. Acknowledgement requires good faith. What we're talking about here is a national act of declaration that a great wrong has been committed. Acknowledgement is achieved when the perpetrator, in this case the federal government, and the beneficiaries of the atrocity or atrocities, this would be Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, recognize and publicly admit their culpability. So the perpetrator admits its culpability. Redress. Redress is the remedy, the making it right act or acts of restitution for the grand crime by the perpetrator. Typically, restitution takes one of two forms: restitution or atonement. Right. In this case, the goal would be to restore the formerly enslaved to a condition they enjoyed prior to their enslavement. But this is not possible for several reasons. One is that those individuals are now deceased, and even if they were alive today, they would not have had the experience of a non-enslaved existence to which they could be restored. It is possible, however, to move their descendants toward a more equitable position had they not endured those injustices. We focus on restitution as the appropriate form of redress rather than atonement, because it is impossible to expect African Americans collectively to agree that sufficient steps have been taken to justify forgiveness. We have clear metrics for determining when restitution has been achieved that cannot be established for atonement. What would restitution look like? True reparations would eliminate racial disparities in wealth, income, education, health, sentencing and incarceration, political participation, and subsequent opportunities to engage in American political and social life. We're talking about compensating Black American descendants of U.S. slavery for past repression and exploitation, while also dramatically decreasing the stubborn existing obstacles to full citizenship. True reparations would lead to a sharp and enduring reduction in racial disparities, especially the Black-white wealth gulf, and a dramatic increase in Black well-being. Closure, C, closure of ARC, the last letter of ARC, perhaps the most controversial aspect of the reparations program that we advocate, is the victims' agreement that the perpetrators have met the debt owed and no further claims would be made unless, and this is critical, unless there is a renewal of the harm or imposition of a new harm. So closure requires mutual reconciliation between African Americans and the beneficiaries of slavery, legal segregation, and ongoing discrimination towards Black Americans.
We'd like to emphasize that one of the things that we've learned in the process of discussing our book and discussing reparations is that language is critical. And we've determined that the phrase slavery reparations is something that we reject because it gives the impression that reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery is exclusively attributable to the harms of slavery. And so I'd like to share a passage in our book in which we talk about the full range of harms that are relevant to the case for African American reparations. And we say the following: from here to equality draws a thick line from the nation's origins to the present. The case we build in this volume is based on all three tiers or phases of injustice. The first is slavery. The second is American apartheid, or the Jim Crow period, which is a phase in American history that was accompanied by 100 massacres that took place all across the country between the end of the Civil War and the 1940s. The grim atrocity that people are now paying attention to, finally, that took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921 is only one of these instances of these massacres. And of course, in North Carolina, we all should be familiar with what took place in 1898 in Wilmington and its consequent repercussions. Then the third phase that's relevant to our case are the combined effects of present-day discrimination and the ongoing deprecation of Black lives. Most advocates of Black reparations have focused exclusively on the injustice of slavery as the basis for redress. Law professor Boris Bitker argued that the case for Black reparations should center solely on the harms of legalized segregation, while Roy L. Brooks, also a legal scholar, has argued that the foundation for Black reparations is the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. We submit that the bill of particulars for Black reparations also must include contemporary ongoing injustices, injustices resulting in barriers and penalties for the Black descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. The sociologist Joe Fagan catalogs the continuing injuries inflicted on Black Americans, including wage penalties, physical and psycho-emotional health wounds, and community and institutional damages. Despite the Brown versus Board decision in 1954, a wave of federal legislation in the 1960s and 1970s intended to eliminate legal segregation and the enactment of anti-discrimination laws. Despite all of these three considerations, Blacks continue to bear the weight of American racism. And that burden is manifest in labor market discrimination, grossly attenuated wealth, confinement to neighborhoods with lower levels of amenities and safety, disproportionate exposure to inferior schooling, significantly greater danger in encounters with the police and the criminal justice system, and a general social disdain for the value of Black people's lives. The legal apparatus created by the Civil Rights Revolution does little to address the complex web of harms imposed upon Black Americans today. Taken individually, any one of these three tiers of injustice, slavery, the regime of legal segregation and subordination, and current discrimination, makes a powerful case for Black reparations. Taken collectively, they are impossible to ignore. And from our perspective, the cumulative intergenerational effects of white supremacy are best captured by the economic indicator that is presented by the racial wealth gap in the United States. The wealth gap, where wealth is defined as the difference between what you own and what you owe, averages about $840,000 in net worth per Black and white household. That's the gap, $840,000 in net worth. Black American descendants of U.S. slavery constitute about 12% of the nation's population, but possess less than 2% of the nation's wealth. And if we were to bring the Black share of wealth into consistency with the Black share of the nation's population, which we view as a primary objective of the reparations project, then we would be talking about giving Black American descendants of U.S. slavery a sum of wealth that would be consistent with the 12% figure of the population. And this would amount to approximately, or at least, $11 trillion. So that's the baseline for the size of the reparations plan. Now, the idea of reparations itself is not an ancient one in the context of the Black community's history. It actually begins at the point at which Black Americans were initially enslaved as Africans on the continent. And so we observe the following about the origins of the reparations movement. We say, just as enslaved Africans were the first abolitionists, liberating themselves and their families whenever possible, so too were Black Americans the nation's earliest architects of reparations. American reparations advocates were motivated by the federal government's failure to fulfill its promise of an endowment of 40 acres and a mule to the formerly enslaved, made on multiple occasions toward the end of the Civil War and in the years immediately following 1865. When General William T. Sherman and Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton asked Reverend Garrison Frazier, a native of Granville County, North Carolina, what he and other freedmen would need to sustain themselves after the Civil War wound down, Reverend Frazier replied, land. Sherman and Stanton had come to Savannah, Georgia in January 1865 to query Black leaders about their vision of the way forward as President Lincoln sought to transform the war-ravaged country. 20 Black leaders, also members of the clergy, had selected Reverend Frazier as their spokesman, and he explained, the way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and turn and till it by our own labor. We want to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own. Now, this desire for land was actually supported by Sherman. A few days later, Sherman issues Special Field Orders number 15, which designates the strip of territory originating in the Sea Islands of South Carolina and extending into northern Florida, bordered by the St. Johns River, as territory that was supposed to be designated for the settlement of the formerly enslaved. This is territory that had been previously owned by the slaveholders. It amounted to approximately 5.3 million acres of land. And it was supposed to be a prelude to a full-scale program of reparations that would have amounted to at least 40 million acres of land being distributed to the formerly enslaved. What happened instead? Well, President Lincoln was assassinated, and his successor, Andrew Johnson, was a deep sympathizer for the sentiments and beliefs of the Confederate cause, even though he had resisted secession. And as a consequence, he reversed all of the initiatives that were taking place to provide the formerly enslaved with the full material conditions for American citizenship. And in the process of reversing those initiatives, he eliminated the effort to provide land reform in the context of the 40 acres project. So about 400,000 acres of land were actually distributed to about 40,000 of the formerly enslaved. That's 40,000 people out of a total of 4 million individuals who were formerly enslaved. But even that land was taken back from them at Johnson's behest and restored to the former slaveholders. Now, at the same time, the federal government was undertaking a project to distribute substantial tracts of land to white Americans, beginning with the Homestead Act of 1862, legislation that was passed during the middle of the Civil War. The federal government began to allocate 160-acre land grants to white settlers in the western part of the United States, including recent white immigrants from Europe. In fact, I think it's now estimated that 1.5 million white families were recipients of these Homestead Acts. Our image of this process is largely associated with the wagon trains that were moving westward. We also refer to this process as homesteading. But essentially what it was the federal government giving substantial land grants or handouts of land to large numbers of white Americans, while Black Americans were being denied any form of restitution for the years of bondage. And this is the beginning of this enormous racial wealth gap that we are witnessing today. It also was the reversal of a reparations effort. And it was not until the latter part of the 19th century that a substantial movement for reparations got underway under the leadership of Callie House, a woman who had been enslaved herself, who made her living by taking in laundry. And she was essentially a grassroots leader of an effort to provide pension funds for the formerly enslaved. This pension fund movement eventually grew into an effort that had the support of 300,000 petitioners, individuals who had all themselves been formerly enslaved. And the petition was submitted to Congress. But the powers that be were very, very disturbed by the success that Callie House had been accomplishing in building this movement. And so they proceeded to undermine her. And the way in which they undermined her in a final step was to accuse her of mail fraud and then to have her be convicted of mail fraud. And so she was actually sent to prison for, I think, 2 or 3 years. But in the process, they essentially gutted her program of action. And just a final aside in my remarks here, the mail fraud charges were precisely the same strategy that was mobilized to curtail and constrain Marcus Garvey's efforts to build a Black nationalist movement that would have included a claim for reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery.
So I wanted to ask if we have time now to talk a bit about HR 40, or if we need to move to the next portion. If we could just get a heads up.
One way or the other. We can't hear you.
Maybe a thumbs up to let us know, or thumbs down. Oh.
Yes, can you hear?
Thank you very much. All right. So
I'm very happy that you talked about Callie House, and I would like to. I'm sort of wondering if, when I was reading, I thought your work is kind of a continuation of hers to some extent. And there was another work I was reading about Jefferson Barracks and the history of St. Louis, and realizing that she was put in prison there was really something. That it must have been absolutely horrendous for her to be imprisoned as a woman there. And it was something like she did that work for something like 30 years at a time when she would have had to be, right, and on a horse and wagon to try and reach that many people.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
And
And she traveled endlessly. I mean, she was tireless.
the mail fraud charge was particularly strange and twisted, because they essentially argued that she was building a movement to make a claim that would never be paid. And
Yes.
so as a consequence, she was defrauding the members of her effort.
Like, well, of
It
course,
was fraudulent because she would be,
pay reparations. You know, like what was she thinking?
yes, just to even think that it might work was
Right.
so
Right.
easy. It was
It
that it was.
delusional. It was delusional.
So I guess in that sense, we are following in her path.
So yeah, and I am also really, there were a couple of things that made me gasp kind of early on when you were talking about, you sort of talk about the mythology, personal ambition, and then start going through some research that both talks about the differences in wealth between certain groups. Like I'm a single mom and a single white mom, and you talked about the difference between a single white mom and a single black mom in terms of wealth, and you talked about a single white woman in her 20s compared to a single black woman in her 20s when they both have a college education. And some of the numbers really kind of made me gasp a little bit. Like there was such a...
The median wealth for the single black woman who recently completed college is actually negative.
So like minus $11,000.
$1,000,
Yeah, that was a part where I really gasped. And then you think like, what's happening? Is it the loans? Is it the, anyway, it's just.
Well, let me say, the reason why individuals who are black who go to college come out with significant student debt is because their parents do not have the initial wealth resources to support them going to college without coming out with significant debt. And that's one of the advantages of being wealthier, is you can enable your sons and daughters to complete their college education and be debt-free at the end of the process. So
all those in vivo transfers. These are, gifts that are made while the donor is still alive, and it's significant both for the fact of them, but the amounts are significant, but also the timing of these gifts. If you are hired for a new job, but you need a car, or you need assistance moving across the country, and your parents are able to make a sizable contribution to your future life, that's really important. Or if you are purchasing your first home and your parents are able to help with a down payment, or a wedding gift, or a gift for the new baby, all of these are moments when Black families certainly would contribute what they could, but they don't have the kind of resources that white families have on average, and aren't able to make those substantial contributions, financial contributions to their children's present and future.
I'm looking at the chat and I'm thinking maybe we should forego talking about HR 40 now and bring Councilmember Winston into the conversation with us.
Terrific.
Like I said, I hope we continue to have this conversation, which will pretty much set it off pretty well. One of the things I will say, if you don't already, definitely follow Dr. Darity on Twitter. He is active, and I'm sorry, Mrs. Mullen, I couldn't find you on Twitter, but in putting out that we were going to talk, I definitely got quite a few responses for folks that were intrigued about this conversation. And one of the things that you mentioned in the book, in terms of when you lay out the plan, is that this has to be done. This has to be done through an act of Congress, right? As you mentioned, that this has to be a national program. And you explored in Chapter 3 that the U.S. would not have developed economically as it did without the coerced exploitation of Black labor. And with that said, in order to remove those long-standing shackles of history, the only way to really do this is through acts of Congress and follow through on a national scale. But I don't think you let any of us off, right? I think there's more to do rather than just voting in Congress members that will work to champion HR 40 or writing them. There's a role for all of us to play, I do believe, whether we be average citizens or somebody like me that is elected in a city council that can do things. But as you said, as Mr. Mullen stated earlier, the things that we potentially doing are not reparations because of the scale and the need for that national kind of lens and approach. But what is the best way that we can advocate for reparations to make them a reality if we aren't a member of Congress?
So one thing I wanted to say about in response is that, you know, changing the face of the Congress is very significant. And we don't want to downplay that at all because we don't really think any of this is going to happen with the Congress that we have. So mobilizing individuals, neighborhoods, communities to actively get engaged in the political process is really, really important. Now, you said something about HR 40. We are in the unusual position of being, huge, super duper supporters of reparations, but we do not support HR 40 at all in its present condition. And perhaps I could, kind of share a little bit about why that is the case.
Please do. That was definitely one of the follow-ups is how do we make
it very good. Thank you for the lead in. All right.
We're prepared on this one.
So as some of you may know, HR 40 or House of Representatives Bill 40 is the legislation that would establish a commission to study and develop proposals for Black reparations. HR 40 does not cause reparations to happen. It calls for the creation of a study commission. It was first introduced in 1989 by the late Representative John Conyers of Michigan, a Democrat. It has been a useful placeholder for 30 years. The name of the bill is a nod to the 40-acre land grants that Sandy talked about. These were the 40 acres that were promised and then denied the newly emancipated Black Americans at the end of the Civil War. So in the intervening years, since HR 40 was first introduced, we have learned a great deal about what a program of true reparations should look like. It's not to you, Otis Griffin. In addition, we have a better understanding of the harmful effects of the cumulative the cumulative effects of the government's policies across generations. These are policies that advantage white Americans while disadvantaging Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. So HR 40 in its current state does not contain a clear directive that will deliver true reparations. It must be revised to activate a commission that will draw up a plan for restitution that, first of all, specifies the eligible recipients, that targets elimination of the Black-white wealth gap as its goal, and supports direct payments to the claimants. The bill also must identify the U.S. government as the party that must pay compensation to the eligible recipients, and it must direct the commission to produce a report with a legislative map fulfilling these 4 objectives. So none of that is in HR 40. So to be a little more specific, by eligible recipients, we mean Black Americans who are descended from persons enslaved in the United States. So those forebears who were denied those promised 40-acre land grants, and they must have self-identified as Black, African-American, Afro-American, or Negro at least 12 years prior to the creation of a reparations plan or the enactment of a reparations commission. The wealth gap differential, we mentioned this before. This is the gap is something that the federal government created and has maintained for 155 plus years. It's now in the neighborhood of $10 to $12 trillion in 2016 dollars. It should be eliminated. Blacks constitute, as we said, about 12% of the nation's population, but are in possession of less than 2% of the nation's wealth. So eliminating this gaping racial wealth disparity, that is, direct payments to Black American descendants of U.S. slavery of approximately $840,000 per household would bring the Black share of wealth at least into proportion with the Black population in this country. So then direct payments to eligible recipients rather than to organizations or to corporations or to colleges or universities or even neighborhoods should be the touchstone. There are both substantive and symbolic reasons why this is the course that must be taken, but it's also the plan of action that was taken by the most successful redress programs around the world. When you look at the case of the Holocaust victims in Germany, Germany paid directly restitution to those individuals. And actually the United States government, which was not the perpetrator in the case of the Holocaust, has paid and continues to pay reparations to American citizens who were victims of the Holocaust. In the United States, so the domestic reparations program, the Japanese American redress program called, and this is a consequence of Japanese Americans being illegally incarcerated in the United States during World War II. The federal government, Congress, made the decision that it would make $20,000 basically token reparations payments to all of the individuals, some 89,000+ individuals who were interned. Direct payments is the way to go. In the case of the 9/11 victims of that terrorist attack, in the case of the Boston Marathon bombing victims, direct payments for what happened. In the case of the U.S. hostages in Iran, in 2015, the U.S. government decided to pay reparations to those individuals to the tune of $10,000 per day of their captivity. So you're talking about a maximum of 444 days. So these individuals have received $4.3 million for their captivity in Iran. We were estimating that if Black American descendants of U.S. slavery who were victims of American apartheid received $10,000 a day for 10 years of being subjected to legal segregation, they would receive over $36 million from the U.S. government.
So you're hitting on something that I wanted to talk about. On page 28 of the book, you says this isn't a slavery issue, but this is a wealth issue. Right. But there's also the difference between income and achievement and wealth, right? Right. I think a lot of what perhaps what the three of us represent, right? You guys are at Duke University. I went to Phillips Academy, Andover, Davidson College, Brown University. Some would say that, we are a representative of some type of reparative policies or programs that allows us to achieve the things that we do. That is not what reparations looks like. Is that correct? What is the difference between making these direct payments that will increase the income and the actual generation of wealth?
The premise is that there is an important distinction between income and wealth, and that the racial difference in income is not as dramatic as the racial difference in wealth, although there is a significant gap there as well. And the fact that we observe that there are some Black Americans who appear to be highly successful doesn't really tell us about what the comparative condition is for most Black Americans in comparison with most white Americans. I think we're burdened by an illusion when we see highly successful individuals who are relatively well-paid athletes or relatively well-paid entertainers. Their condition and circumstance is really not representative of the degree of disparity that exists between Black and white Americans. Let me point out that 1/4 of all white households in the United States have a net worth in excess of $1 million. it is only 4% of Black households. And when we get to the uppermost end of the distribution, when we start talking about the very wealthiest Americans, they are almost exclusively white. So, and we should pay attention to the low end of the distribution as well. White households with the poorest levels of income, that is, white households in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, have higher levels of wealth than all Black Americans taken together. So wealth is a stock of resources that's associated with the difference between our assets and our debts. It's the net value of our personal property, and it's distinct from income, which is largely determined for most people by their earnings, which is a flow. And wealth essentially is a personal insurance plan, as well as a personal opportunity plan for individuals to fully participate in American society. And so to the extent that those disparities are significant between Blacks and whites, it provides us with a useful gauge or metric for determining how much reparations should be paid. One final comment in this context: reparations is not an anti-poverty program. It is a project to fulfill a debt that is overdue for 156 years.
And I wanted to say, well, first, I'm an independent scholar. This is the Duke professor. But I wanted to add a bit to that. You know, if I steal your cattle for 8 years, and eventually you threaten me within an inch of my life, and I say, okay, I'll stop. Is the debt paid? You know, I've stopped stealing from you, but I still owe you, for all those cattle that I stole from you. And this is partly what we're talking about. You know, you don't say, well, you've done so well with those cattle you stole. You shouldn't have to pay me back. That's not how things work. That's not how things work in this country or any other country for that matter.
And if I'm the person who the cattle was stolen from, if I've somehow managed to do okay financially, it doesn't mean that you don't still have an obligation to reimburse me for the damages that you've done to me. And that's why I want to reemphasize that this is not an anti-poverty program. This is a debt to be paid.
When other countries and even the U.S. has been faced with having to pay reparations to individuals who've been victimized, they don't say, "Oh, we're only going to give you X amount because you've earned so much money, or because you're doing so well now." Uniform payments are frequently what is prescribed.
Nobody asked Japanese American recipients of reparations how well they were doing financially in the moment.
I mean, they all received exactly the same amount.
So one of the questions I had when I was reading it, and you end up answering it, when you call for this congressional approach or an act of Congress that is needed to do this, the first thing I thought was, hey, this would be paid out of tax dollars. And if American descendants of slaves are paying tax dollars, isn't that sort of like you paying for the reparations of that cow that you stole from me? But you go on to explain that that's not necessarily the case, because it doesn't necessarily need to be funded through the taxation of American descendants of slaves or anybody. Can you kind of expound on how we would get there in terms of where that money would be sourced from?
Well, one thing too, the funds could be, made available tax-free. Those land grants through the Homestead Act were tax-free. And in fact, if in many cases, if the original recipient of the patent died, any debts that were owed were taken care of. They were erased. And so a similar kind of, sweeping initiative could be applied to Black reparations. But you're going to say something about the taxes and inflation.
I was going to say exactly what you said. You beat me to the punch, as you frequently do. But yeah, I was going to say that the funds that would be distributed under the reparations plan presumably would be tax-free. But we wouldn't necessarily need to finance the reparations plan by raising or increasing taxes. Excuse me. And the reason I say that should be evident from our recent experience with the pandemic, as well as with the Great Recession, in which the federal government virtually overnight approved massive levels of expenditure without raising taxes. The key question with any new expenditure program is whether or not you're going to trigger significant inflation. And so you have to design the program in such a way that you minimize the inflation risk. And we spend some time in the final chapter of the book trying to describe ways in which these expenditures could be made without necessarily precipitating high rates of inflation.
How would that happen? What is something? Is this something that would be a one-time thing? Does this have to get done in a certain amount of time, or is this something that can be stretched out over time?
So it doesn't have to be a one-time thing, and I understand it could take multiple forms. Some people get really caught up in this whole notion that we're trying to create wealth, and so the funds probably should not be so liquid, so easy to spend. Which is why we also suggest it could be in the form of an annuity or an endowment account or a trust account. But we believe that the full reparations payments should be made within a decade, because the amount is only going to get larger the longer you wait. And it makes sense to go ahead and, earmark the funds. And we would say, to $2016. We don't want a situation where, some people have proposed that, you tax wealthy people and then decide, to give how much money is going to go for reparations. But we're saying, let's consider the wealth that white Americans have right now and make that decision, calculate what the and we believe that figure would be close to, 11 or 12 trillion dollars, but make that decision now and don't stretch it out longer than 10 years.
Yeah, but if you use 10 years, you're talking about an expenditure of, say, $1.5 trillion per annum, which is something that is hugely manageable, and it can be done in such a way that you don't raise taxes on anyone, but you make the expenditure and you fulfill the debt. And I'd like to say that what we're really talking about is redistribution without confiscation. Let me repeat that. Redistribution without confiscation.
Well, and thank you for because it segues into the next question. Something that you, another reason why you say this has to be something that Congress takes on is that you should not necessarily be punitive towards the businesses whose legacy lives now. Some businesses are still around, but that we're acting within the legal framework that was set out by Congress and by states that follow federal law.
I mean, what they were doing was immoral,
but immoral, but illegal.
But was certainly legal. Yeah.
I mean, we don't hold any individual, to blame, but certainly we would love to see, corporations of every size, but also cultural institutions, colleges and universities using their considerable reputation, their influence, their muscle to advocate for a national program of reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. There is much they could do to help push this initiative and to let Congress know. I mean, these are people who have, Congress members on their speed dial, but let them know that this is something that matters to them, that they believe that, our country is never going to be whole until we pay reparations to Black American descendants of U.S. slavery.
So while private businesses and institutions might not be responsible for facilitating the program of reparations or reparations programs where they exist, do they have any responsibility? Do they have any responsibility to make sure that is seen to happen at any point in time? Do you feel?
I mean, we
What is
think
most
so.
unrivalled?
You know, it's the right thing to do. It's the moral thing to do, and it's long overdue. You know, we just think it would be a tremendous feather in their cap to be on the vanguard and to lead the charge.
I mean, if individuals who feel some sense of responsibility or organizations that were complicit with these atrocities over the years want to take some actions of atonement, then fine. But they don't have the capacity to meet the bill, and they are not, in a fundamental sense, the culpable party. The culpable party is the federal government because it created the legal and authority framework that sanctioned and allowed all of these atrocities to take place, whether we're ranging from Elaine, Arkansas, to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to Detroit, Michigan, to Washington, D.C., to Omaha, Nebraska, with respect to these massacres. The federal government, at minimum, turned a blind eye and allowed these events to take place without any punishment being applied to the individuals who were the perpetrators of these horrors. So we feel strongly that it's the federal government has this obligation. But we'd also, did you mention, we should mention it if we haven't, the question of resources at the municipal and state level.
Yes. You know, when you look at the capacity of states and local governments to pay reparations, their combined budgets, all the cities, all the states in the country's combined budgets amounts to about $3.1 trillion. So this means that they would need to use all of their resources for 4 consecutive years to retire that $11-12 trillion debt. And they'd have nothing, you know, no money to operate their cities and states with. So that's not likely to happen. I mean, I think part of it is we have difficulty wrapping our brains around this figure, you know, of $11-12 trillion. I mean, as Sandy said, it's huge.
Which
it's
is
a huge amount of money.
While the president comes out in Tulsa and does something really admirable, which is to tell the true story of what happened in Tulsa.
Which is unprecedented that any U.S. president would admit, you know, that a massacre occurred in any American city that was as destructive and was as damaging to Black lives. You know, Black people run out of town, murdered, their homes, businesses, communities of faith burned to the ground. That people, you know, took to airplanes and dropped firebombs on them. It's incredible that a U.S. president finally is you know, willing to say, yes, this happened.
Yeah.
This happened in this country, the land of the free and the home of the brave. And the city fathers, the state fathers and mothers, and the national government did nothing. Yeah. And in fact, they aided the cause of the white mobsters. That is phenomenal. But that said,
when he proposes certain kinds of initiatives that he claims will close the racial wealth gap, this is whistling in the wind. If you think about it, the total amount of funds that he talked about yesterday that were supposed to in some way contribute to closing the racial wealth gap was no more than $200 billion. And in light of a gap of $11 to $12 trillion, that's virtually meaningless. And so, you know, Kirsten was saying we do have some difficulty wrapping our heads around how much $11 trillion is. Here's an exercise that we have tried to provide to give people a sense of how large it is and why it's something that has to be done by the federal government. If there were generous donors who contributed $1 billion to a fund for reparations on a monthly basis, so $12 trillion a year, it would take 9 centuries to get to $11 trillion.
830 years.
Oh no, it's 830 for $10 trillion.
Oh, I'm sorry, except for one.
Yeah, it's 900 years.
That would take
$1 trillion.
Yeah, 830 years.
So I sit on a board as a city council member of an organization that has a budget of $2.6 billion a year. About somewhere between, I believe, 700 to 800 million of that is our general fund, where we do have a lot of discretion. But I also wrestle
with about four, reparations payments for about 4 Black American households. Your entire budget.
It's something else, isn't
it's because it's 200. Well, it's not per household. It's 4 people.
Well, $840,000.
Okay, yeah. Well, that's the But
you said 2.5. You said 2.5.
Well, he said, but the discretionary fund was about $700,000. Is that right? 700
million, 700 to 800 million dollars. And our overall budget is 2.6. And we're going to approve that in a couple of weeks. $2.6 billion dollars.
So 2.5 months of payments.
But as you said, the federal government has the resources. But what I struggle with is that the federal government's resources are only as good as what the states and municipalities do with it, right? I think back to...
No, we're not having any intermediation from the state or federal governments. These funds will go directly to eligible recipients. So in a strict sense, try to imagine a situation in which somebody puts an additional sum of money directly into your personal account.
Sure, I understand that.
The federal government would do that for every eligible recipient of reparations. So
that's how the COVID funds work. They straight to people's bank accounts.
It would not go through the states. It would not go through the municipalities. And we have a very bad history, in fact, of decentralized programs in terms of their implications for Black Americans.
Understood. I guess what I was getting at was at the removal, the stealing of wealth, through those 3 time periods, not just slavery, Jim Crow, and the perseverance of atrocities that are done by the state. Again, I think about the legacy of the board that I sat on in terms of urban renewal. What is called Negro removal, right? That was the stealing of generational wealth from landowners, from business owners, and that legacy is alive and well. And these were federally funded programs.
Absolutely.
But they were only facilitated because the city of Charlotte bought into it. They didn't have to, right? They didn't have to do these things where we clear cut our neighborhoods to create the banking center of the Southeast and one of the most powerful finance centers in all the world. So when somebody like me and the organization that I represent does make a decision that we want to put a restorative lens on this, that we want to repair the harm that we have done. And part of it is my job to go up to the federal government and advocate for policies, spends, and laws to be passed that help us achieve our goals. The HB 40, I'm sorry, I don't think it's HR 40. I'm thinking of North Carolina legislature of nomenclature. If House Resolution 40 isn't it, if we are not in a position to facilitate reparations in its true sense and form, how do I advocate for this? How do we pass policies that actually do get us closer to repairing the harm that we have done alongside the federal government that does bear the responsibility? I can only think that you're judged by the friends that you keep, right? So do we escape responsibility for facilitating this restoration that is needed from a municipal level?
Well, there are a couple ways to respond. I mean, the first we would say is you do both and. it certainly is important that cities identify the policies, the procedures that they have in place that have disadvantaged Black people historically. Look at every sector. It's certainly going to be more than one program. I'm almost 100% certain that Evanston, Illinois, disadvantaged Black residents in more areas of, than housing. So, look at all of the sectors across the city and reverse, stop those programs and, resolve not to do those things again. And you could also, Durham, North Carolina, for example, the city council passed a resolution advocating a national program of reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. And it also pointed out the flaws of HR 40. This is also something that the city of Charlotte could do. We think it's really important, though, to, separate these types of initiatives, and use the terminology racial equity programs for these local initiatives. But when you're talking about a national program, then you would use this term reparations. But yes, advocacy is really important. Charlotte is a huge sector in the economy. And I think, legislators would listen to, what the leaders and shakers, in Charlotte thought was important. If Charlotte, was able to say, our residents think this is really huge, not just the Black residents, but the white residents as well. But we also say, get your own house in order. Oh, hello. Get your own house in order. That you need to, take a look around and see, who are the thought leaders that you, your family, your organization, your employer, your artisanal beer collective, your book group, who are the thought leaders that you consult when you're making a big decision? Who is getting the contracts? Who are the vendors? Is your division a sundown town, which is to say one in which, Black people are welcome to work but can't live, for example? There are lots of things that we can do to get the conversation going, but mostly we would say, work locally on these racial equity initiatives, but also push Congress, lobby, petition Congress for a national reparations program. We keep waiting to see if some entity will hire a crack shot lobbying firm that will, roll out a program from coast to coast that both seeks to educate. I think Rachel Kuby asked about the importance of, first of all, just remembrance. But we need to, first of all, publish textbooks that include the full story of our history, and to have them in place for several generations, so that all of us have a common understanding of our histories. We talk in the book about the fact that we never have had a deconfederatization process in the United States. And if there was ever a moment when anyone doubted that was the case, January 6th of this year, which was a hallmark of all of these symbols of Confederacy. These symbols do matter, and as we've said, in Germany you don't see monuments to Goebbels, to monuments to Hitler. It's not legal to have these images, these symbols on your person, in your place of business, in a public space. And that process still can happen in the United States. I think it would make a big difference. People are confused, really, about what is or is not American. When we're talking about the Confederacy, we're talking about secessionists. We're talking about traitors to America, not noble American citizens. And that's a point that needs to be made.
Yeah, not patriots.
Yes. One of the things that you talk about both in the book and the podcast is dismemory, and there's so much talk right now about the teaching of history, and so much contention about the idea of critical race theory, or basically teaching accurate history. And I wonder if you could talk about that, because you talked about sort of also part of a reparations program. I'm sorry, I'm going to mute for 1 second since we have a loudspeaker.
I think, am I about to get off easy? You two said you guys were going to ask me questions too. So I hope you don't let me off the hook too easily out there.
But I did want you to mention that a Never Forget program for African Americans and the ways that African American life has been devalued in the United States historically. I was really moved by that, and by comparing that to the Never Forget campaign after the Holocaust.
I mean, we were surprised to learn of the scholarship of a colleague, Jacqueline Dowd Hall, that looks at the role of groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the American Daughters of the Revolution in the commissioning of textbooks, history textbooks, that hew to the lost cause narrative. When they could not identify authors who were writing textbooks that romanticized the Civil War, that de-emphasized Reconstruction, that slavery was this kind of offstage thing that was really a minimal part of their lives.
And it's inaccurate.
They hired their own authors to write those books, and in some cases wrote textbooks themselves. And those textbooks were in place for many, many decades. One of the textbooks that was used in my high school was one such textbook. So yes, there absolutely is a need to put in place textbooks that, and it's not just textbooks, but books that tell the full history, that don't hide.
If we tell the full history, and this is something that you mentioned in the book, then we have to include the story of indigenous people to this land. So let's say if we could snap a finger tomorrow, and Black African American reparations, a program that was able to be implemented over the next 10 years starting tomorrow. How do we square the responsibility that we have to our indigenous brethren? Because I would imagine that I don't know, I'll speak personally, that even if we get that program of reparations, we wouldn't be telling the true history until we resolve some of the sins that we have there as Americans to our indigenous brothers and sisters or folk.
So you were right. There absolutely is a case to be made for Native Americans for reparations in this country. But it is not the case that we are making in From Here to Equality. Our understanding is that Black Americans are fighting for full citizenship rights, but Native Americans are fighting for sovereignty rights, and they're two different things. But absolutely, yes, that is a humongous issue, and we certainly support it. But it is not the case that we are making in From Here to Equality.
And I think, if we were to look at the country's history in a very accurate way, we would acknowledge that the acquisition of the Western territories was a consequence of outright conquest of Native peoples, and the land that was allocated under the Homestead Acts was, for the most part, land that had recently been seized or appropriated from Native peoples. So this is a very complicated story, but it's important that it's a story that's told honestly and that we confront the injustices that have been performed in such a way that we actually do set up mechanisms for compensation. But the types of compensation that is due to the Native American population, I think, takes a very different form from the type of compensation that's due to Black American descendants of U.S. slavery.
And to be clear too, I mean, we acknowledge that the entire country, all of it, belonged to Native land. So it's not just the West, but all of it, and that will require a very complex form of restitution that absolutely should happen.
Yeah, I don't know if I should say this, but I will. We look somewhat cynically when people give land acknowledgments because they don't plan to give the land back. And so, what's the point?
I'm beginning to get
you're
the sense.
changing your point of view.
Just a little. I'm beginning to get the sense. I was talking with my sister actually, who read me. Hold on. Who read the land acknowledgement that University of California, Los Angeles uses, or maybe it's their entire UC system. And, they're thinking of it as a wedge. It's a way of beginning to put this on people's minds, because we're a country of people who have really bad memories, and some of it's just willful on our parts. But I think these landing announcements are just, I'm imagining, just the tip of the iceberg. Yeah.
It reminds me, this is a quote in there that just has stuck with me. The shackles of history are long-standing and must be removed.
Yes.
I think that speaks to that full truth that we must come to if we're going to deal with this.
And I am realizing that we've kept you far longer than an hour, all of our speakers, and I'm so grateful to you. And we can look and see if we've missed any of the issues that were brought up in the chat on the side. But I also want to make sure that I invite anybody who's listening to a learning circle. Where
I'm finishing right now. I'm gonna come get you in a second. All right. Oh, I'm sorry, guys.
We're going to start a learning circle next week on Thursday, the 10th at 4 p.m. And we're going to listen to the podcast that Ms. Mullen and Dr. Darity have created with Duke University with the Ways and Means podcast. That's a 6-part podcast, and each week it'll be a 6-week series, and each week we'll listen to an episode of the podcast together and then have a conversation about what was in it. If you are up to reading the book, it is a wonderful book. It is a heavy book. It is very well written, very, very clear, and not academic language or anything like that. It's just heavy subject matter. If you'd like to read the book, you can read a section of the book each week also, and we'll also talk about that. And I would love it if anybody would join us to do that. I think that there may also be, I think somebody wanted to post contact information about a group who'd like to bring Dr. Darity and Ms. Mullen to Charlotte. And yes, I think Jeremy has just put that up for a group here, if anybody would like to contact them so that we can have these scholars come in and talk in Charlotte, and we can continue the conversation.
We see that one of the people is Dr. Carey, who we love and adore. So
yes.
We're glad to see from
yes.
hear from her.
The same for me.
For posting this just noticed.
Yes. So, but thank you so much for joining us, and I'll let you conclude. And if you would like to say good evening, but I want to thank everybody for joining the library and listening tonight.
Well, we'd like to thank you again for having us have the opportunity to present to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg community, to have a conversation with Councilmember Winston, and to have a conversation with you about something that we think is one of the most compelling issues that needs to be addressed in American society. We don't believe that reparations will solve all problems. So, for example, Otis Griffith, who has chimed in the chat, is very, very concerned about prison abolition, and it's not clear that reparations will address the problem of mass incarceration. So there are other policies that must be pursued to end the kinds of harms and damages that have been perpetuated in this society. But we certainly think that reparations can transform America, particularly with respect to producing the kind of democracy that this society has long claimed that it is, actually producing that type of democracy in a real way by creating the conditions for full Black American citizenship.
Well, thank you, Rachel, for including me in this conversation and thinking of me. Thank you, Dr. Darity and Mrs. Mullen, for the work that you're doing. I look forward to continuing this conversation and continuing to find ways to build. And I hope that, as we get out of this pandemic, which we are still in, I hope everybody still realizes that you guys can come on down and we can show you some things that we're doing and again, figure out how to get build this city, this state, and this nation that I think we all want and deserve. So thank you all for watching tonight. Thank you, Charlotte-Mecklenburg Library. Thank you for all that you're doing. I look forward to continue to grow with you guys as you grow as well. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody. And I do want to say the heart of this book is incredibly hopeful. The heart of this book is that we can solve these problems that we think are so intractable. The heart of the book is just we can do it, and that's a wonderful
Absolutely.
thing to come away with.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Good night to all.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Library